I guess, University of Lisbon now. And he leads a group called the Intangibles Reality Lab, which I think is an outstanding name for a research group. And he's from Milwaukee, although he's been in the UK for a long time now. He did his undergrad at UPenn. He got a Master's of Arts in Cultural Theory at University of Manchester, and then a PhD in molecular physics from Leeds University. And he really has run the gambit in both degrees and research. So he calls himself a scientist, artist, and cultural theorist, and he's definitely demonstrated that in his publications and his work. But I think he's most well known scientifically for his molecular simulation and machine learning and chemistry work, and the art and his virtual reality work. And he's definitely done some great art work in augmented reality. And I guess he kind of blends the fields together. And I first found out about Dave's work when we started the AR/VR work at University of Rochester. I strongly believed that VR would only be a teaching tool or an education tool in chemistry for a long time. And then I think about maybe 3 years ago, I saw a GIF that Dave put up on Twitter, I think, of someone folding a knot in a protein. And that's when I realized you could do things in VR that you could never do with, normal tools like molecular simulation. I could never figure out a way to fold a knot in a molecule except by holding it in your hands and doing that. So I think Dave really has been an inspiration for me to view VR not just as a way to visualize things, but to actually do, science with it. And I'm really happy to have him here. He's probably one of the best, probably the best person in the world who's doing AR/VR work in chemistry, especially in trying to break new ground and making it a tool for research. So I have to tell one fun fact about Dave. I don't know if this is a fun fact or not, but he
oh no,
gained some notoriety from being removed from a classical music concert. I think they said it was the first eviction since the 18th century from a classical music concert. Which is really cool. And he got to write an opinion article in The Guardian about the experience. So, all right, with that, I won't say any more.
Wait, hang on. That never happened. That was a performance art stunt, by the way.
Okay, hold on. That's not what you said in The Guardian. You didn't say it was.
That was an experiment in fake news. There was no crowd surfing involved.
Oh, the crowd surfing. Yeah, that was fake news. I'm sorry.
No crowd surfing. So we were doing fake news back in. That happened in 2013. We were doing fake news before Donald Trump made it cool. So there you go.
So Dave has been ahead of the curve in many ways. And all right. So with that, let's welcome him and hear about his great research.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Andrew. Really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm going to just kill my video for the sake of bandwidth because I have a lot of videos and things, and I just want to save my own bandwidth a little bit so that my videos can stream. So I'm just going to do that for my own video. And yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me to speak. And I was really excited when Andrew got in touch about the center that is at Rochester. I was looking at the website and looking at the combination of skills and expertise and the things that are available and to explore augmented and virtual reality. And I was really excited by it because I think it takes a lot of different kinds of skills to make augmented and virtual reality content that's good. And I think it's great. And so thank you very much for inviting me. And I really wish you all the best in the center. And if there's any way I can help, please let me know. So here, this talk, I'm going to do a very brief history of biomolecular structure modeling. Like I said, one slide. I think I might have two or three slides, but it's a massive oversimplification. But it will just give a little bit of a background for people that maybe aren't familiar with why the structure of molecules is important. And then I'll talk a little bit about that will kind of give a background for why we started doing a lot of things that we're doing. And then what I'll do is I'll talk about some of the applications we've developed in our lab and some of the results from our lab developing VR tools. And I guess the thing that distinguishes a lot of what we're doing from a lot of VR work in general is I guess two things. It tends to all be mounted in cloud, which is something we've done as a result of COVID actually over the last year. Specifically, we have it running in Oracle Cloud and Google Cloud. And we really emphasize in what we do multi-person a lot. And that's really important, I think, because when you have a multi-person, so virtual reality has this funny word before it, which is virtual. And the word virtual means like it's kind of not real, but you think it's real, right? But what we found is that when you turn a virtual reality experience into a multi-person experience, and you can share that experience with other people to actually, kind of have a collective experience of a shared reality, that's not really virtual anymore, right? As soon as I can have a conversation and a memory established about an experience I had in an alternative reality, I think the word virtual isn't really appropriate. It's just a different form of reality. And so the multi-person aspect of a lot of things we're doing is really important. I think it's one of the things that changes VR from being like, it's almost like someone could share in your dream, right? You call your dream a dream because it's this experience you have, and you just can kind of tell people about it secondhand, but they can never be in your dream with you. But if imagine someone could be in your dream and experience that phenomenology, you wouldn't use the word dream anymore. So, right. And so I think there's a similar thing that's happening with virtual reality. And so I really want to emphasize the multi-person aspect, and I'll show some evidence later on in some of the work we're doing lately with the neuroscience lab at Imperial College. This is really important. So there's two primary applications I'll talk about. I'll talk about what Andrew spoke about, interactive molecular dynamics and virtual reality, which we use this acronym IMDVR to refer to. And I'll talk about protein dynamics, and I'll highlight some recent work we've done looking at the binding of small drugs with proteins, with some applications to actually study COVID molecules. And then I'll also talk about a recent fork of that work on a project called ISNES. And so ISNES is a fork of the virtual reality of framework. And what we've been doing with ISNES is we've been developing it in order to explore it as an alternative to actually psychedelic drug therapies. And so this is work in collaboration with my colleague, Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial College in London. And then I'll talk about some of the future directions. So there you have it. So just really quick crash course on biomolecular modeling. So molecules are important all across our modern lives. They're important in nature. They're important for understanding how living systems operate. They're important in industrial applications. They're important everywhere. And molecules are characterized by the fact that they have these crazy three-dimensional structures, right? And so this is Dorothy Hodgkin, who was a Nobel Prize winner, who is famous for a number of things, but one of the things she did is she discovered the structure of penicillin, which is located behind her in this diagram. Can you see my mouse cursor? Are you able to see my mouse cursor?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so yeah, you can see the structure of penicillin right here behind her. And another biomolecule that she also resolved the structure for. And so molecules are crazy three-dimensional things, and they have structures that are really non-intuitive, right? So unlike when we design machines for factories, human design concepts emphasize symmetries and reproducibility and things that have a very low error rate, and things that are usually relatively rigid in their structure so that there's not to minimize variability. In biology and at the molecular level, it's a little bit different, right? There's a lot of thermal noise. Things are moving and wiggling and jiggling all the time. And there's a lot of motion and dynamics. And so the machines that nature designs to do the jobs that like a cell needs to do, for example, to carry out the actions, the molecular actions required for life, what you find are that the machines have a very different structure, right? They don't tend to be very symmetric. They tend to be messy. They tend to fluctuate a lot. They need to minimize the errors, and they need to be reproducible in the jobs they do. Otherwise, you can lead to disease states. But in general, these molecular machines have designs which are really non-intuitive, and these crazy three-dimensional structures that are pretty non-intuitive for us to imagine and to imagine the structure of, and also imagine how they move in order to carry out the job they need to do. And so as one of the points to emphasize is that over the last several decades, people have realized that it's not only the structure of molecules that are important, but it's how they move. And so they have flexibility and motion and wiggling and jiggling. And for several years of biomolecular science, people use these rigid kinds of models. And this shows Max Perutz. So Max Perutz was one of the people that was awarded the Nobel Prize for the first ever crystal structure of a protein in 1962. And a crystal structure of a protein is basically taking a three-dimensional picture of a protein. So you can see where all the atoms are in space, and you can devise the structure of it. And he famously would construct these models of molecules, which looked something like you see behind Dorothy Hodgkin here. So these rigid structures that are kind of like little balls and sticks you pop together and arrange in a 3D structure. And so this is Max Perutz giving a lecture after he won the Nobel Prize. And he has a model of a protein. So proteins are made by stringing together amino acids like beads on a necklace. There's 20 different amino acids that nature uses to string these things together. And here he is holding a string of amino acids. And just so everybody knows, so proteins are really important, right? So DNA, which you've all heard of, is basically the code that tells your body how to make proteins. Proteins are effectively the little molecular machines that do all the jobs required for life. And so here's Max Perutz holding a structure of a protein. But what's interesting about this model, so now this model, unlike the model that Dorothy Hodgkin is holding here, Max's model has flexibility, right? So you can see it kind of droops, and it's subject to the forces of gravity. But the price you pay for flexibility with a tangible model that you can hold in your hands is that the forces that you are battling against, if you like, are the forces of gravity, right? Whereas in molecular structure, we know that the forces that cause molecules to hold their shape are not gravitational forces. In fact, they're electrostatic forces. And so what you see here is, Max has this protein, but it's got the wrong shape. It's kind of ironic because he won the Nobel Prize for finding out that proteins have detailed shapes, right? So this is my stupid little science meme here where he's telling people that, normally this thing has secondary structure, but the limitations of the materials that he's dealing with don't allow him to show the complex structure of this model. And so what we've been looking at over the last few years is how can we go beyond the limitations of these physical models using kind of the latest in GPU technology and human computer interaction technology and increasingly cloud computing. And so the solution I'll talk about here, there's my stupid little Monty Python animation, which I'll just do a few times because I spent way too long working on it, is we put Max Perutz in VR, and now we're gonna be able to give him a model that has the tangibility of this physical model, but where the forces now can be modeled using rigorous physics that have arisen over the last 40 to 50 years and have been the topics of a few different Nobel Prizes over the years, most recently in 2013 to Martin Karplus and Arya Varshil and Michael Levitt. And so we published a paper in 2018 where we kind of outlined a prototype, if you like, for how to do this. And this was the paper where the knot tying GIF comes from, which Andrew alluded to, and I'll show a video of that in a moment. But what we described in this paper is how you could have models which had the tangibility of the models which Max Perutz and Dorothy Hodgkin are holding in their hands, but now the physics that would characterize the interactions of these molecules with one another would be rendered in real time using cloud supercomputing. And so I guess I want to emphasize, this isn't standard game physics, right? So I know if you use Unity or Unreal Engine, you have all kinds of game physics in there, collisions and bouncing balls and flying trajectories flying through the air and gravity and things. This is different kinds of physics, right? So this is physics using force engines that are derived from actually quantum mechanical forces. And so this is real special physics that requires significant computational resources to run. But I guess the point is that computers are fast enough that they can do this stuff in real time. And so we published this paper kind of showing how this was possible. And it was really exciting. It got picked up by New York Times, for example, which was cool. It kind of really seemed to captivate people's imagination about what was possible for scientific imagination with these new tools that were available. I think like BBC came to the lab and did a piece on it, and Nature did a little piece on it. So it was really exciting to just observe that this seemed to captivate people's imaginations. And so here, if you like, is how it works. This is just a schematic of how it works. This is the schematic that I kind of sketched in well, this is a fancier schematic that we made. A digital artist helped us make more recently for one of the papers. But this was the schematic that we kind of sketched out, that I sketched in my notebook several years ago for how this works. And I'll just explain it real quickly. So here we were working with, we work with Oculus Quest and stuff now, which obviously is really nice, but still isn't, the renders and things aren't as good as if you use things like the Valve Index or the HTC Vive. So you have some base stations here that do your tracking. And then I have here a computational server. So my little server machine has some GPUs in it, and that does my physics in real time, my molecular physics rendering in real time. Okay, so it solves these equations of motion in real time. And then there's connected to a little router here, and then the router's connected to one desktop VR machine. So that's a VR, we call this a VR client. See, so this person, this person in the lab is connected into their client, and then the router is also connected to another VR client. So this person's connected in there. And because they're connected to the same computational server, which manages the information between them, they can inhabit together the same virtual world. And so what you see here is they're standing around this molecule C60. So this is Buckminster. It's also called Buckminster fullerene because it looks like some of the geodesic domes that the architect Buckminster Fuller developed back in the 60s and 70s. And this molecule was discovered by Harry Kroto and colleagues several years ago, and it was actually, the discovery was also awarded a Nobel Prize. So it's kind of this iconic soccer ball looking molecule that crops up in kind of weird places like combustion and deep space. And it's really beautiful and symmetric. So here are two people in the lab, and they can kind of be in VR with one another and move these buckyballs around. And so here you see two of the people in the lab, Mike and Becca, kind of passing buckyballs between themselves, right? So they're in the same space, they can see one another, they can see the molecules, and they can really reach out and touch these things as if they're tangible objects and pass them back and forth. And you see that the molecules are wiggling. The wiggliness and the jiggliness and the bounciness of the molecules is a result of the physics that's being simulated in real time on this server. So I just want to emphasize, this, again, this isn't game physics, right? This is real-time physics that's effectively being solved using kind of the state-of-the-art engines in molecular physics nowadays. So there's another few GIFs. So this is our one of the knot tying GIFs. I don't know if this is the one Andrew saw, but we have a lot of versions of this one because this one did seem to really captivate a lot of people's imagination, including myself actually, because I have colleagues in physics who work on knot topology, and like the algorithms required to tie knot, they study actually molecular knots. So it turns out that almost 1 or 2% of the proteins in the entire protein structural data bank form knotted structures. And nobody really knows why biology would bother to tie proteins in knots. There's a lot of hypotheses around. But anyway, trying to tie knots in proteins is incredibly algorithmically difficult. And, you know, but it's also the kind of thing that like a 3 or 4-year-old knows how to do. They get really excited when they can tie their shoe, right? So it's one of these really interesting examples where like the spatial intuition of our brain is really good at certain activities that if I had to sit down and write a Python script that was a generic knot topology script, it would be thousands of lines of code and really complicated, and not many people could do it. But most 4-year-olds or, you know, most grad students would be able to, or most professors would be able to tie a knot. And Mike's tying a simple 3-1 knot. If you know about knot topology, it's this is a 3-1 knot. We have some other videos where we tie 5-2 knots and other higher order knots, which are more complicated. So here's Mike just tying a simple knot as a demo. And here he is with a little methane. He's got a nanotube and he's threading the methane through the nanotube. And so, you know, there's a lot of interest in pores in molecular physics. So pores are important in materials chemistry. They're also important in biochemistry. Cells have pores that selectively let certain things through and don't let other things through. So the methane through the nanotube is kind of a prototypical example of you know, diffusion through a tight space, which is important in a lot of areas of molecular science. And this is a kind of a cool thing that this is a collaboration with my friend Rachel Frere. So this again is the same knot tying video, except now this is my first person view tying the knot, and I'm actually doing it with my hands. So I'm not holding the VR controllers anymore. We developed these gloves, which we call the OMG VR gloves, which are the open source Mudra gloves for virtual reality. And there's a paper in the archive where we publish the design. You can make these yourself if you want. They use electronic textiles. So my friend Rachel Frere, she's actually got a degree in fashion back in the day, but she's actually one of the world's experts in what are called e-textiles, so electronics textiles. So this is how to embed conductive fabrics into wearables. And so Rachel and I sat down over a few months, 2 summers ago, and we kind of bashed out a design for this. And these are the gloves. This is Rachel wearing the gloves. They're called the Mudra gloves because you make poses like are shown here, where you close your thumb and your index finger, or your thumb and your middle finger. And if you go to the Far East and you see statues of Buddhas, you often see them doing these kinds of poses, and they're called Mudra poses. So we call these gloves the Mudra gloves because they encourage these kinds of poses. But then, so I can do these poses, and I can really just literally reach out and touch the molecule as if it was an object. I don't need to use the plastic control anymore. I just touch it and grab it and tie the knot. And so something we're kind of actively developing. So if you're interested in that, you can have a look. They're really, you feel like a superhero when you're wearing these gloves. So I just had to show this. And so I guess the thing that got people excited about the paper we published, I just want to outline this real quickly. This was really important, right? We had struggled for years to kind of convince people that, you know, this was real. This stuff was important, right? It was a real challenge to figure out how to do it, right? We had this problem where, like, when we would do hundreds of VR demos in the lab for scientists, and very imminent, 3 Nobel Prize winners came to the lab, a number of highly esteemed people in molecular physics, and we put them in VR and we'd show them one of these simulations, and we'd show them molecules they studied for their whole career, and they would reach out and touch these molecules and manipulate it. And like, I'm really not kidding. Like, some of these people would come out as if they had a kind of like religious conversion experience, right? And I think the reason is because for them, these molecular dynamics had only ever been they had always dealt with it as a form of just a purely mathematical abstraction. And I think if you gave them the opportunity to kind of touch this abstraction, for a lot of people that had studied these systems for years and years, it was a very deep experience for them. Now you can argue, like, whether it should have been a deep experience, or maybe that means all their priorities are messed up, but whatever, like, it was a deep experience. But we really struggled to capture that in a kind of quantitative way, which is, as you know, scientists, we like to have graphs and quantitative ways of demonstrating the utility of the tools we're developing. And so one thing we did in this paper was, which was a really good thing to do and seemed to kind of drive home the point to people, was we just got a bunch of people who didn't have experience with VR or interactive molecular dynamics to come into the lab and do the structural transformations that I've outlined. So task A is, thread the methane through the nanotube. Task B was to take a helical molecule. This is called helicine. It's in a left-handed helix here, and then you change the helicity from a left-handed screw sense to a right-handed screw sense. This is something that a lot of chemists worry about a lot. This is called a change in chirality. And then this was the last one. You take this helical peptide protein, and then you tie it in a knot. And what we did is we developed the same app so that it ran in exactly the same way, with the only difference being the interface. So we had 3 different interfaces. One, you could control the dynamics of the molecule with just a mouse and a screen, like I'm doing now, moving my mouse on a screen. The second was you could use a touch screen, so just use your finger instead of a mouse. And then the third was VR. And then we just got a bunch of people to do these tests, and then we just measured what was the rate of accomplishment. So on the left-hand panel here, this is the rate of accomplishment. So higher bar means a faster rate of accomplishment. And then on this side, this is the distribution of times of accomplishment. So here, a lower value means a faster accomplishment time. And so I just draw your attention to, the nanotube task. Basically, it's about 2 or 3 times faster in VR compared to the 2D interfaces. The knot tying task is effectively impossible with the 2D interface. I'm not really sure how anybody managed it with the mouse and the screen, because I couldn't do it, and I consider myself to be somewhat of an expert in this domain. But it's effectively, I would say, it's that's statistically almost 0. So whereas in VR, very high accomplishment rate. And the helicine task was quite interesting. Here, you see, if you look at the distribution of times, you see that VR affords a little bit of an advantage, but not very much compared to the other interfaces. And that's because the easiest way to change the screw sense of this molecule is actually just to take it from one end and then just move in a clockwise, in a circular motion counter to the screw sense that you want. So it's a simple 2-dimensional motion. There's no 3-dimensional motion required. So it's kind of nice to see that for a structural transformation, where the most effective way to enact it is purely 2D, VR doesn't have that much of an advantage. And so this kind of really drives home the message that for structural and conformational changes that are intrinsically 3D, VR is really, really effective. So there's a number of quantitative benefits we've shown over the year in IMDVR. As I said, we've shown over and over that if you're designing and studying molecular objects in 3D for several tasks, studying them, cognizing them, visualizing them, you see accelerations that are from 2 to 10x faster in 3D versus 2D. And this was kind of an interesting application we published a few years ago, where we actually ran, we trained neural nets to learn quantum mechanical potential energy surfaces. If that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. But we basically kind of trained artificial intelligence to learn how to solve the Schrodinger equation for certain molecules. And we found that if you did it, using standard tools versus doing it using VR, the learning rate, if you use VR curated data, so some grad students curating data in VR for a couple hours, the neural nets learned at a rate that was 10 times faster compared to the standard approaches, because the quality of data that was generated was much, much higher. And so we kind of know with machine learning that if you have good data in, you get good results. And so this just showed that you could really efficiently curate really high quality data. And so that was kind of a nice result. And then, qualitatively, there's a lot of benefits of IMDVR, specifically in education. And so we've been exploring how to use some of these tools as new ways of helping students, undergrads in Bristol and further afield, understand complicated 3D structures. So the tools that the lab develops are open source. And it's called Narupa is the framework we have. There's 2 different flavors of Narupa. There's a molecular builder, which lets you build molecules. And then there's the IMD version, which is interactive molecular dynamics. Just have a little video. This is the builder in action. So this shows Mike building. I can't even remember what molecule he's building here, but something just to give you a very simple idea of how this works. So here's Mike building it, and then he's going to adjust the orientation of some of the atoms, and then he's going to add some functional groups onto it with the various menus. So adding some methyl groups on, decorating the molecule. This is what chemists do, is they basically take molecules and they decorate them to try to get them to function in certain ways. So this gives you the kind of idea. He's changing the bonds from single bonds to double bonds, changing the scale. Kind of gives you an idea of how that works. We're working on making, at the moment, the builder only works for a single person. We're working on making that multi-person. We haven't done that work yet. It's in process right now. And so there's a few things you can use Marupa for. This is kind of a cool thing. So this I'll come back to some of the psychedelic work we're doing in a little bit. But when I first met Robin Carhart-Harris, I invited him to Bristol to give a seminar. He heads up the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College in London, and he's really neuroscience, medical background, and he's interested in psychedelics. So I pulled from the PDB the crystal structure of LSD bound to the human HT2B serotonin receptor, which is available on the Protein Structural Data Bank. And then Robin and I went into VR and looked at it. So it's a membrane-bound protein. So here you see the membrane that it's bound in from a distance. And so you're seeing my first person perspective, and that's Robin right there. He's over there. That is the protein. That's the HT2B serotonin receptor. And so we are entering into the protein right now. And so here we are. So it's like entering into a kelp forest or something when you're inside the phospholipid bilayer. So there's Robin, there's me. And so there's the LSD molecule, and so there is Robin. he was like a kid in a candy shop when I first showed him. It was his first time in VR, and we were showing him the crystal structure of LSD bound to HT2B serotonin. So there he is looking at the bound pose. That gives you a kind of example of structure visualization. Another thing we've been working on recently is, this was work we started a few years ago with my colleague Adrian Mulholland in Bristol. And this is neuraminidase, which is a molecule that's important to the life cycle of flu viruses, specifically to some of the strains of Asian flu that emerged around 2013, 14, 15. And the molecule that Becca is docking to neuraminidase here, this molecule is Tamiflu, right? So Tamiflu is a drug molecule that has been developed in order to fight flu. And the idea is that by binding to this protein, Tamiflu binds to this protein neuraminidase, it then locks up this active site so that neuraminidase can't do the catalytic job that it normally carries out, right? So it kind of locks up the machine so the machine can't function. So here's Becca docking it, and then it has this little protein loop that has to sit over the molecule in order for it to be a stable pose, so that you see as Becca pulls the molecule out, she first has to kind of pull this little loop down to kind of let it out. The loop's like a little lid. You can think of it like a little lid that closes in the molecule. And then when she pulls it back in, she'll do the docking pose. She will put the loop back over it. And so that's some recent work that's been published in PLOS One last year. And recently we started looking at, could we use this approach to look at potential drug molecules that have been proposed in the fight against COVID-19. And specifically, we looked at this this oligopeptide, which has been synthesized by, I don't know, some pharma company. I can't remember which one. We look it up in the paper. But this protein, there's some evidence to suggest that it's a potential target for this molecule here. This is called MPRO, stands for main protease. And so this is one of the molecules that's really important for COVID-19 reproducing itself as it moves from one host cell to find another host cell. And again, the idea is if you can develop a molecule that can bind to this MPRO, then you lock up the molecule so it can't do its job of helping the cell reproduce. And so that's one way to kill the virus. And so published another paper recently where we showed that it was possible to generate a host of sensible binding poses using the IMDVR approach. And that's now out. So it says impressed. This is a little bit out of date. I should have updated it, but here's the link to that. And here's again our little schematic showing Becca. Now you see the little people in VR wearing masks. So they got their masks on, which is good. Although the lab's been shut, so no one's even wearing masks anyway. So it was kind of like a joke of what we wish we could be doing. But here we have, me not doing anything, just watching what Becca's doing, and Becca's binding to the active site to look at how this oligomer inhibitor can bind into the MPRO and knock it out so that it can't help the COVID-19 viruses reproduce. And then this is kind of, I want to move into the last phase of the talk here. This was something we did immediately when the lab closed. We did this in April, and this was the first time we adapted Narupa on the cloud so we could all go into VR together to look at molecules. So I'm just going to show this real quick.
Computer.
There's a lot of excitement in this video because this is the first time we did this, so there's a lot of giggles. I'll just warn you.
Computer recording.
Can you just tell me if you can hear the sound on this? Does everyone hear the sound?
Yeah, we can hear the sound. Yep.
Perfect. I will play it then.
Computer recording. So here we are in Bristol, connecting to a supercomputing cloud-mounted molecular simulation that's on OCI in Frankfurt. We're starting on Zoom, and we're using, all of us have the audio and input and output. So we're using the headphones and the microphone on our headset. And what we're going to do is we are slowly going to turn off our Zoom video, and then I will meet all of you guys in virtual reality. So let's do it. So what we're going to do is we are going to go through in turn and all say hello in VR. So hi, I'm Dave, and it's really good to see you guys in here.
Hey, I'm Mike, and I'm in Easton.
Oh, hey, I'm Mark, and I'm in Totterdown.
Oh,
I'm Jonathan, and I'm in Redlands.
I'm Alex, and I'm in Cotton.
I'm really sorry.
And we have one more person who hasn't said hello.
Sorry.
And introduced themselves.
Oh, I'm Roz. I'm in Clifton at the moment.
Roz, you look so startled.
Sorry.
I'm glad
It's
we're
just
showing our
because-
technology spans the entire of Bristol.
Yeah, we got Bristol covered, that's for sure. But our simulation is running in Germany, so we actually we have bigger coverage than that.
Right. So that is what we have started calling in the group Zoom on acid, because it really is a sense of co-presence with colleagues distributed around the world. I was actually just in that environment yesterday with two people from San Francisco and someone in Kiev and me here in northern Portugal. And it is absolutely just bizarre. You feel like you're having guests in your living room, and then you come out and there's nobody there, you're by yourself. And it's a really interesting framework for some of the stuff we've been exploring lately. And now this is the last thing. I just have a few slides on this. I just want to mention a crazy other application of this, which we kind of stumbled upon. So Andrew mentioned I do a lot of artwork, and that's kind of, with the VR work, it's carried us into interesting territory, I guess, just studying perception and cognition in VR more generally, and how that works and what happens, and what are the sensations and feelings that arise for people, and how do people respond to being in a space with someone that's virtually there that you feel like you're next to but isn't actually there. And so through speaking with my colleague, my friend Robin Carr-Harris, who heads up the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial, we started looking at VR as an alternative to psychedelic drug therapies. And this is the setup of the lab in Bristol. or well, the former lab in Bristol, which has now been disassembled and stripped for parts so that everybody can work from home. This is what it was. This was one of our labs. So here I have a computational server, and then I have 4 people all connected via, they're all wearing gloves, I should say. They're all wearing the Mujer gloves that I showed in the previous slide, and then they're all connected up to their own client. And then we put like a mat on the floor, because that turns out to be a really good way for people to know not to go off the space and run into walls and things. If they feel a soft mat under their feet, they have a tactile sense of like, what's the safe space. Avoids a lot of accidents. So here are the people, and we developed an experience called ISNES, which is effectively just a fork of Narupa. It's literally the same framework, but what we did was we gave ourselves artistic freedom to, instead of limiting ourselves to the conventional rendering strategies that are used in molecular physics, we just gave ourselves artistic freedom to just go wild and basically do whatever we want. And so one of the things we did was we decided that instead of rendering people as sort of, you know, weird VR avatar things, we were going to render people as diffuse, energetic essences, right? Like you would see in a wave function, right? So if you work in chemistry, you often look at pictures of electron density, and they kind of look like these blurry cloud things. And so we thought, well, like, you don't have to look like some goofy, you know, Facebook avatar. You can just look like some diffuse energy field, and what's the perceptual effect of that on people? And we kind of built the algorithm using the rendering strategies that are used in rendering quantum mechanical electron distributions. So for example, you have something called an overlap integral, which means that if my energy field overlaps with the energy field of another person, then the luminosity of my field increases depending on the overlap integral. So if there's a lot of overlap, I have a brighter field, and if there's no overlap, then I respectively have dimmer fields. So this means that if I can coalesce the bodies together, I can get very luminous fields, for example. So it's weird tricks for body rendering from physics that hadn't really been applied before. And this video just gives you a little bit of a sense in world of what this environment looks like. This is with four people in the space, all rendered as diffuse energy fields. And there's a molecule in there, but again, it's a much sparser aesthetic render instead of the sort of more literal molecular render. It kind of gives you a sense of, there's a whole bunch of states. The whole business experience is about a 45-minute experience, but that gives you a sense, a couple of clips of what it looks like. But we developed this experience ISNES, and with COVID, we ran it distributed on cloud. So instead of people being located in the same lab, people were now located all over the world. And we developed a set of nodes that across the world that ran ISNES. And so this was the location of all our nodes. We had 5 in the Bay Area, we had 1 in Tennessee, 1 in Boston, 1 in Washington, DC. We had 6 in Bristol, 1 in London, 1 in Vienna. And so we would have the sessions work so that there's a facilitator, someone who leads the session. That's this person here. And then there's 4 participants. And so people log in, and via the power of cloud computing, everyone kind of logs in. Their spaces are oriented radially in this kind of mandala shape. So there's 4 people plus a facilitator. And so this shows everyone starting out at the beginning of the experience at the edge of their respective mats. And so you see their kind of distinct fields. And then at certain points, there's instructions, and also it just arises spontaneously where people will move toward one another. Well, they'll move to the other side of their mats, and now you see they're all coalesced into one really luminous thing. And this is I sent this work to Mel Slater. I don't know if people know Mel Slater. Mel Slater is kind of the #1 researcher over the last 2 decades in VR research. He was very famous for he wrote a very famous paper about what he called body transfer in VR. So I could inhabit the bodies of virtually simulated avatars, and Mel kind of showed I would respond physiologically based on the experiences they were undergoing. And this was one of the big papers that drove the idea of VR as being an empathy machine. And so this experience of people coalescing, we've called energetic coalescence. And I sent this to Mel and I said, I think we might have discovered a whole new class of experience that's only possible in cloud mounted distributed VR. Like, this is a thing you can't experience in the physical world in any meaningful way. Like, if you try to do this, you quickly, you meet electrostatic interactions with people if you try to coalesce with them. There's also all kinds of ethical problems, right? So you don't want to try and coalesce with people in general. But in virtual reality, you can actually do this in a safe, guided, gentle way. And it is really, really remarkable, the effects that this had on people. So we published a paper on this, which we submitted to kind of the premier conference on human computer interaction, a computer called Kai, and it got a lot of attention. But what we really did was we kind of, beginning from this idea of energy coalescence, we use the concepts, methods, and analysis strategies that are being used in psychedelic drug research right now to design and evaluate isness. And so isness is basically a multi-person VR journey where participants experience the collective emergence, fluctuation, dissipation of their body's energetic essences. And then when we analyze the feedback of isness participants using the same exact questionnaires that are used to analyze psychedelic drugs over the last decade, so nearly 1,000 experiments, psychedelic drug experiments over the last decade, what we found was that the isness responses were comparable to double-blind clinical studies that people gave after high doses of psilocybin and LSD, right? And so this is like crazy, right? Completely crazy. We were absolutely floored when we kind of did this study. And so here shows isness people distributed across the world. So this is like one session with 4 different participants. This is around 4 different people in our node network at one time for a given session. And here's the results of isness. So we did 2 different isness studies. And what I just want to very briefly explain, how do they measure the strength? How do they measure the experience in a psychedelic drug experience? So there's a questionnaire that's been developed at Johns Hopkins University called the MEQ30, developed about 10 years ago. And it's kind of become like the de facto questionnaire you give participants after a psychedelic psychotherapy session. And it collapses, there's 30 questions and it collapses. There's several questions that address how ineffable was the experience. So I is inability to capture the experience in words. M is a category that captures, they call it mystical, but what it captures is your sense of connectedness. So it's how connected do you feel to yourself and to others and to nature following the experience. P is positive emotions. So how do you feel good after the experience? And T is you have a sense of, as if the typical boundaries of space and time fell away. Transcendence of space and time is what the T stands for. And so you give people this questionnaire and then you analyze the results into these 4 factors, and a higher score means a more intense sensation in one of those factors. And then if, you plot over the last decade, all, nearly 25 different experiments with 1,000 participants that have been done in psychedelic drug research, what you generally find is that all your placebo results have low scores in the 4 factors, and then you give people very strong doses of psychedelics and you basically have very high scores. And then, low doses kind of live somewhere here. Here's all the moderate to high dose stuff. And, isness kind of sits right in the middle of moderate to high dose, like clearly separable from placebo effects. And so this is really interesting because psychedelic drug therapy is currently being evaluated as a breakthrough therapy for treating treatment-resistant depression by the FDA right now, right? Extremely promising. But it has a lot of risk factors and it's really expensive because you need trained psychotherapists to help guide the session. And so we're excited about this because, if it turns out that VR can offer some of the sort of experiential phenomenology of a psychedelic experience, but without the associated risks, there might be some nice applications in sort of clinical and mental health. And I guess the last thing we did was, one of the things we measured was people's sense of connectedness following isness experience. And so we just gave a very simple question pre and post how do you feel in relation to the group? You know, I feel totally separated from the other ISNES participants, or I feel like, you know, we've completely merged is number 5. So we asked people this question before and after. So pre, you see a mean of like 1.2, so somewhere around here. And post, we saw that increased to 3, right? So a pretty substantial, statistically significant increase in people's sense of connectedness to a bunch of strangers they'd never met before, which is, I think, really interesting, specifically given a lot of the isolation and loneliness that is characterizing these COVID times for many people. So wrapping up, yeah, we're moving the lab to the west coast of the Iberian Peninsula. So we're going to have a lab node up in Santiago de Compostela in Galicia in the north, and we're going to have a lab node in Lisbon in the south, all connected via super fast internet so that we can run distributed VR experiments and carry on developing things. And also, if anyone's interested in this, we have a lot of funding from the European Research Commission, which support this stuff moving forward. And, you know, the 2 projects I talked about here, the Narupa project and the ISNES project, are going to be, you know, real focuses of the work moving forward. And so, you know, if people are interested in this, or you know people that are interested in this, or, you know, you want to come experience the nice wine and sun in the west coast of the Iberian Peninsula, you should get in touch with me, or you should let other people know. Final thoughts. Yeah. A lot of what we're doing is open source. We're trying to build a user and developer community. So you should, you know, feel free to get in touch or have a look at the repo or whatever you like. And I guess I just want to leave off with, you know, that this combination of high performance cloud computing, GPU compute with, you know, new human computer interaction technology, AR, VR, MR, I think has created a lot of fascinating opportunities for new forms of sort of immersive digital research that is robust despite COVID restrictions. So thank you very much. Thanks to the funders. And that is what I have.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dave. So I think we'll open it up to student questions.
I have a quick question. So I was just wondering about your INDVR project. Are the users in the same temporal space as the molecules? I mean, like, how does, for example, 1 second time spent in the VR environment compared to the actual simulation time?
Yes, good question. Okay, so Andrew's an expert in this, actually, so he can probably tell you a lot about this too. But so typically, you know, a molecule, if I have a chemical bond, like you maybe learned about a CC bond or a CH bond or whatever, typically that will vibrate, you know, 10 to the 14 times per second. So something like that, right? And then when I'm in VR, I'll see maybe 3 or 4 vibrations per second. So if you do some very simple math, you can see that what we've effectively done is we've, you know, slowed down time for the human perception system by a factor of roughly 10 to the 14, 10 to the 13. And I should say, that's not just for VR. That's a general feature of any physics simulation, is that physics simulations, even if they're not running in an interactively visualizable mode, they will be much, much, much slowed down, you know, 10 to the 13, 10 to the 12, in order to run the simulations, simply because the simulations take a lot of computational horsepower to run. So they're always slower than the real thing. But that's a really good point, right? So time is effectively slowed down really significantly when you're in VR with a molecule.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed that talk. Thank you. So for IMD VR, when you're interacting with these molecules with your hands, are you still doing quantum mechanical forces, or are you using like normal forces to do that interaction?
So when you there's 2 things. There's 2 things here. Let me decompose your question. There's kind of two things. So the molecule themselves, basically, the way they wiggle and jiggle depends on solving either the Schrodinger equation or solving approximations to the Schrodinger equation. So solving hardcore physics equations in real time. And there's been a lot of progress with that, especially with new developments in machine learning. Now turns out they don't need to solve the Schrodinger equation. They just have an AI learn the solutions and they just call the AI to give you a fast solution, right? So that scenario is continuously evolving and will just get faster and faster and faster. And who knows what there's a big horse race of who can be the fastest and the best in that. And we don't really play that game. We just use what's the fastest and the best and do that. But that's the real deal. As far as we know, those are the best models we have to simulate the forces. When I then touch a molecule, I exert another force on it. And that force has to be, so that's a really interesting question, right? So this is kind of a design question. Right? What is the best form of a force if I'm going to interact with a molecule? Because I can't actually touch, a molecule in real life, right? And that's where this stuff's really different than like if I'm grabbing a glass in real life, it's really easy to know like how to measure that experience compared to grabbing a glass in VR. Because like I know what the size is, I know what it sounds like when I put it down, I know like kind of what it feels like, what it looks like. Same with surgery. If I'm simulating surgery using a haptic device, I can actually measure like what's the typical force resistance of human skin. And I can just program my haptic device to be like, okay, I need to simulate it like this. So I can always have a design reference. If I'm simulating something that's available to me in the real world, I always have a design reference where I can say, well, let's just measure the real world thing and make VR like that. The complexity of simulating physics when I'm making it interactive is I don't have a design reference, right? So I don't know what it's like to touch a molecule because that's not an experience that's available to me in my day-to-day waking reality. So I can't go and do the measurement. So part of you ask a very deep question, right? Which is why I'm going off on one, which is we've thought a lot about what are different ways to construct the force to do this. And so it turns out there are some references. There are experiments where people do grab individual molecules and pull them, and they're called atomic force microscopy. So we've thought a lot about how do people run atomic force microscopy experiments and how do they do forces in there? And then we've used that as a reference for how we do forces. But at the moment, we've experimented with a few different ways of doing the forces that are described in various papers. We've used just like harmonic springs. So like I pull farther and the force gets stronger. The problem with that is you can get numerical instability in your simulation. So what we tend to use is Gaussian functions where the force is very strong if I'm close, but if it's very weak when I'm far away. And so in that case, my finger sticks to the molecule like a magnet. So if I'm close, it pulls it strong, but if I'm very far away, it pulls it very weak. And that's the one that we use the best, which seems to be the most stable and generates the most, the best results. But it's an open question, how to design the force for a thing that I don't have a design reference for in normal life.
So I noticed that a lot of your work, it's about the forces, right? And it's a lot about the interaction of you touching the system and seeing how it responds. So I feel like haptic feedback would be an obvious or an important aspect of this. Is that something you're exploring or thinking about, or do you have any thoughts on that?
So the complexity of haptic feedback is I don't know what it should feel like, right? So like for surgery where haptic feedback is used very successfully, it works well because I know exactly what I'm doing because I can, like I said, if I'm simulating cutting skin, I can just I can do a real measurement and say, well, what's the force like? And I'll program my haptic thing to be like that. And that's extremely effective. The thing with haptic feedback for molecules is like, it's a huge amount of complexity and expense to design a thing that you don't know what it should be like. And so we have done some haptic stuff, but one of the craziest things we found is that people can actually proprioceptively detect differences in rigidity without haptic devices, right? So like we have one of my students has done this because everyone's like, you need haptic feedback. And I was like, do we really need haptic feedback? So we did a user experiment, and we did a blind experiment. We gave people buckyballs of 3 different rigidities. We didn't tell them which was which. And then we told them the only difference was color. We gave them the Mudra gloves. We said, play around with them. And then at the end, rank which is the least flexible and the most flexible, or the least rigid and the most rigid. I can't remember how we worded it exactly, but we worded it in a suitably neutral way that we didn't lead people. And we found that we didn't need haptics, and people could discern the differences in the flexibility and the rigidity just through their brain's sense of proprioception, right? And so I think that work opens up a really interesting question of like, in my mind, is like, how far can you go? Now, obviously there's limits. Like if it's a 2% difference in the force, I probably can't detect that proprioceptively, but we're at a point where we know that there is a limit where people can detect things proprioceptively. And so what we're actually carrying out work now along the lines of your question is we want to figure out what is the quantitative limit of what people can resolve just via the sense of proprioception. And then I think we'll know, like, do we really need haptics to do this stuff? I like haptics. It's just that it just involves a bunch more software, a bunch more drivers that need updates, a bunch more non-commodity parts, and then you just end up with a more complicated software stack. And so I think for me, that's been the biggest barrier, is like, do I really want to try and support something? If it's surgery, it makes sense because you can make $1 billion if you do it in surgery, right? But in molecules, like, no one cares that much, right? So you have to do things a little bit cheaper, right? So that's the question.
Great, thanks. Luke, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was really fascinated by the isness section of the talk. I was wondering if beyond that 30-question questionnaire, my understanding is that the effects of psychedelics last, like days or weeks or months beyond the initial experience. Is there any evidence that isness has a similar effect long term?
Yeah, so that is exactly the question that we're looking at right now. Is we want to rerun the experiments, and then we want to do longer term follow-ups, just like they do with psychedelics. So generally when they do a psychedelic psychotherapy study, I should say, by the way, if people aren't aware of the psychedelic thing and you just think it's crazy, I mean, there is an emerging renaissance of psychedelic science happening right now. Just I want to contextualize that for people. There's a whole, I mean, it is really resurgent. I mean, there's 2 companies that have just done IPOs that are in Compass Pathways and Field Trips that have just done IPOs and are valued at $1 billion for psychedelic psychotherapy. I mean, it really is emerging as a therapy. So just set that context for everyone, which is why we're interested in mapping the VR stuff onto psychedelics. So when they do psychedelic studies, psychedelic psychotherapy course, I should say it's always psychedelic psychotherapy. So you always take a psychedelic, usually with 2 trained psychotherapists. So it's horrendously expensive, right? So that's what problem 1 with it is, like, because you need 2 trained experts, and you have to have a bunch of preparatory sessions and a bunch of decompression sessions. So it's how scalable it is an open question, which is one of the reasons we're looking at things like VR. But when they do a psychedelic psychotherapy study, yeah, they typically do 2-week, 4-week, and 6-week follow-up to see, they call it, is that how long does what they call the afterglow effect endure? And so it's exactly one of the things we need to do in follow-up studies. We haven't done it yet. We measure what was called peak experience. So if you look at the research work, they typically measure, if you look at how psychedelics do it, right after the session, the drug administration, they'll typically measure the peak experience. So they'll give people the same questionnaire in the immediate after, as soon as they're coherent enough to do the questionnaire, they'll give them that. And then they'll do the follow-ups. Our comparisons were just with the peak experience. And our logic there was like, look, like, if we don't see anything interesting in terms of peak experience, there's no point in doing a follow-up. So now that we found that the peak experiences appear to be really interesting, some of the studies we want to do will be looking at the follow-ups for sure. And that's exactly what we need to do. So stay tuned.
Thanks.
Thanks for asking about that too, because the psychedelic stuff is something people are always a little scared to ask about because they think it's so weird. So, but you don't have to be afraid of that. It's all totally serious science.
Have you considered doing any sort of ablation study to see which part of that actually contributed to that effect? For instance, if you were just to have one person versus multiple, or the background, or different things like that, because it seems like there could be a lot of contributing factors, and it would be interesting to see what's giving most bang for your buck.
Yes, absolutely. So what you're talking, we need to deconstruct isness, because isness is a 45-minute experience that involves a lot of different steps. And what we need to do is we need to effectively we need to unravel it to figure out mechanistically if there's certain parts that are having the effect on people. So qualitatively, we know that the energy coalescence thing is a big thing for people, because when we did qualitative feedback, so many people wrote about it, right? They like wrote, this was a thing for me, for sure. But what we need to do is exactly what you said. We need to do follow-ups where we try and distill out whether or not there's specific mechanistic ingredients that are responsible for the effects that we're seeing. And so I actually just bought 10 of the kind of state-of-the-art biofeedback devices, the E4 Empatica wristbands, and they measure heart rate variability, galvanic skin response, and body temperature, and they're proper medical devices. And so you get super, super high data fidelity. And what they've used them in psychedelic research, and they can show like the onset of the trip and then how the trip changes the function of time. So the idea of what we're going to do is we're going to rerun isness with people wearing these devices across the world in our nodes. And then we're going to see if we see synchronized biomarkers for any of the, there's different points in isness where different things happen. And we have a hypothesis that certain points might be more potent for people than other. And so if we see some kind of biofeedback for those points, that would be really interesting. So like when the energy coalescence, at the start, there's an instruction for everybody to coalesce. And you see there's a lot of nervousness, like people are scared because they feel like they're in the same space with people. And then they just collapse in and they realize there's a sense of freedom and it's safe and it's fine. And I suspect we'll probably see something there, but to be determined. We're going to do that with the biofeedback and see if we see anything. I should say Mel Slater, when he did the body transfer work, he showed changes in heart rate variability consistently when people had this body transfer experience. And so VR, there are precedents for VR reproducibly generating these bioresponses. And so that's what we want to try and tease out. Is Mel Slater, is that somebody that people have heard of? Have you guys run across Mel Slater, I guess? Yeah. He's, I mean, he's done a lot of fascinating work in VR, so it's good that you're familiar with him because he's someone that's really pushed the envelope in terms of a lot of interesting stuff in VR.
So we have, I think, time for one quick question, and then we'll have to move on.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll ask a very quick one. So when you talk about solving the Schrödinger's equation using neural networks, you talk about using VR curated data. So can you say a bit more about what VR curation means in that context?
Yeah, I think I might even be able to show a video. I might have to be able to show you an image that could sum it up pretty well. So basically, when you train a neural net to learn a solution to the Schrödinger equation, what you basically, what you do when you study molecular physics, and Andrew is, again, an expert in this, so he can probably tell you about this. But what you typically do is you give the neural net atomic coordinates, or angles or bond distances, or some descriptor. Okay, how you choose descriptor in artificial intelligence is a whole ongoing area that nobody really understands, right? You choose a descriptor, which is usually a set of Cartesian coordinates, and then effectively what you want is a set of energy and forces that come out, right? So the Schrödinger equation, if you solve the Schrödinger equation, you give coordinates, you get out energy. And so it's really computationally intensive to do that. And so I'll just show this really quick video here. It's computationally intensive to do that. And so what you typically do is you, what people have been doing now is just giving some complicated black box neural net, feeding it coordinates, letting it generate energies and forces, and doing it that way, and then trying to optimize things. And that works really well if you have a good data set. And so it actually works really, really well if you have a good data set. But the trick is really getting a representative data set. And so this is the video shows some work by graduate student Sylvia Amabilino. This shows Narupa connected to real-time quantum mechanical force engines. So now we can make and break bonds. So you see she just like she moved a hydrogen from one bond to a different bond. This is working with a way of doing, this is a parameterized version of density functional theory called type binding density functional theory. That's what we're running here in real time. And so she can make and break these bonds. And so effectively what you're seeing right now, what that video shows the data curation, right? And so one of the challenges in training neural nets is getting high quality data along the reaction pathways that you're interested in. And so the plot here on the left shows the data that was obtained using standard sampling techniques. And so here you see that the data gathering is quite inconsistent. And the reason is because when you do sort of automated sampling techniques, the geometries that are generated are kind of crazy, and the wave function runs into what are called convergence, SCF convergence problems, self-consistent field convergence problems. So basically the solution collapses. It can't be solved, right? The algorithm just collapses out because the molecule is placed in some weird geometry that it can't get a stable solution to the Schrodinger equation for, okay? And so you see, this is just the sampling density for a few points in this system. This is the sampling density you get if you use IMDVR. And you see like, it's just a very nice uniform sampling density that covers all the areas you're interested in a relatively like nice way. And so this is effectively the reason that your neural net learns a lot faster, is because when you give it data it's curated in a couple hours from IMDVR by a graduate student, the data is much higher quality than if you give it the standard kind of brute force sampling strategies. And all this is really saying, I guess, is a few hours in VR with the human brain is a powerful sort of spatial cognition machine, is a lot more effective than several weeks on a supercomputer with 80% of your jobs crashing out because you gave it bad input. I mean, that's kind of if you like, that's the message. I'm gonna stop my share here. I'm gonna do it. Yeah. All right, and so that's how that works.
Great, thank you so much. This has been a really fascinating talk, and it's rare we get to see a talk that covers a lot of VR applications. I think this is really good for the program to see a lot of the stuff in action. So let's all virtually emote with clapping, or clap one more time for our speaker. This is really outstanding. And I think we'll have a recording available for this on the XR speaker series through the Studio X. All right, thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dave.
Bye.
Bye.